We followed the Israelites and saw God's dream for them unfolding. And if you recall back a little while, back in Egypt, while they were in Egypt, God spoke to Moses and said, "This is called Abraham." And he said, "I want you to be the father of many nations and many descendants, and this is to reach the whole world." But God had a dream for his people, and we've been following the adventures of the Israelites as they've moved through into the promised land. It has not always been a smooth road for the Israelites, and it seems to me that the unfolding of God's plan for our life is not always a smooth road either. Some of you are going through valleys at the moment, am I right? Some of you are on the mountaintop. Some of you are looking at the mountain and saying, "How am I ever going to get up there?" And God's saying, there is a dream that I have for your life, an unfolding plan that I want to unfold in your life to actually see you be what I want you to be. And many of us over the years have heard this idea that God has a dream for your life, or God has a plan for your life. And I want to encourage you this morning to actually seek God in that. We're going to talk about how do we prepare for God's unfolding plan or unfolding dream in our life. And just as the Israelites, it was a rough journey at times. For many of us, it's also been a difficult journey. As a church, we also believe that God has a dream for our church. We've been talking about our mission statement up on the board up here. We exist to make disciples whose changed lives transform the world in which we live. And from that, we've now got 3 vision statements. You remember what they were? We desire to be a church that inspires people to connect with God and with people, to pursue a Christ-like character, and live as a part of God's kingdom, to connect, to pursue, and to live. And I know that Pastor Jason's going to touch on the second one of those, I think, next week when he brings the message here. So get ready for that one as well. So here's where we find our Israelites today. They are in the promised land. They've crossed over the River Jordan. They're camped outside of Jericho in a place called Gilgal. And they've now set up an altar to remind them of what God has done. But God has some other things he wants them to do. And I'm going to invite Cole to bring our scripture reading this morning. And if you have your Bibles, it's Joshua chapter 5, reading through all of that chapter, really. Thank you, Cole.
Now, am I on here? Yes, I am. I can hear myself even. So, now, when the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until we had crossed over, their hearts melted, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again." So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at Gibeath-Haaraloth. Now this is why he did so. All those who came out of Egypt, all the men of military age, died in the desert on the way after leaving Egypt. All the people that came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the desert during the journey from Egypt had not. The Israelites had moved about in the desert 40 years, until all the men who were of military age when they left Egypt had died, since they had not obeyed the Lord. For the Lord had sworn to them that they would not see the land that they had solemnly promised their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So he raised up their sons in their place, and these were the ones Joshua circumcised. They were still uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. And after the whole nation had been circumcised, they remained where they were in camp until they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." So the place has been called Gilgal to this day. On the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. The day after the Passover, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. The manna stopped the day after, they ate this food from the land. There was no longer any manna for the Israelites, but that year they ate of the produce of Canaan. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message, my Lord, have you for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Here ends the reading.
Thank you, Colin. So here we have the Israelites camped at Gilgal, and God gives them some instructions. They are ready to get into Jericho. They are ready to actually get involved in the defeat of this first city in the promised land. And so God says, hang on a little bit. We need to prepare before we come to this battle. So what we're going to do today is we're going to unpack this passage just a little bit. And I want to share with you right at the very beginning 5 things that God asked these Israelites to do in preparation for the battle. And then at the end of the message, we're going to say, okay, well, what does that mean for us in that? So we're going to kind of do it a little bit differently this morning. But here's the first one, how to prepare. This is the first thing God said. He said they needed to renew their covenant with the Lord. They needed to reaffirm their confidence in the Lord. They needed to have the condemnation that they had removed by the Lord. They needed to remember the commitment of the Lord. And fifthly, to recognize the control of the Lord. So a little bit of encouragement for you as we're going through. You can see where we're coming in our message and you know how far it is to the end. Okay, so that kind of helps you out a little bit. But I want you to take a look at that list this morning in terms of what God asked them to do in preparation for taking hold of the dream that God had given to them. And it begins with renewing the covenant with the Lord in verses 2 through to 7. Now, for the Jew, the issue of circumcision was huge. For the Jew, circumcision was this sign of the agreement, this covenant that God had made with his people. We call it a covenant or a contract or a promise between the Creator and the created. It's a centuries-old agreement that started way back with Abraham, and it was a sign that God had chosen one particular family to pour out his blessings on and to pour out his blessings to others through. It's where the dream began. It was a symbol from the Jews that they would remain faithful and that God himself would be their God. Circumcision kind of marked the Israelites as God's people. Now, let's take a look at Genesis 17, verses 9 to 11. Let me give you where it goes right back to. God said to Abraham, "As for you, you must keep my covenant, and for you and your descendants after you for the generations to come. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised." Verse 11 says, "You are to undergo circumcision. It will be the sign of the covenant between me and you." So it was the mark of, or the seal of this agreement that was made between God, who God said, "You will be my people and I will be your God." And there were some conditions, I guess, for that covenant in terms of the obedience of God's people. Remember, God is always faithful, but it's conditional on the faithfulness of God's people as well. And we know that it was God who brought the people out of Egypt, and we know that it was God who led them through the wilderness, and it was God who had opened up the Red Sea, and it was God who stopped the Jordan River from flowing. He had been taking care of his people in difficult circumstances right through their journey, right from the very beginning. He had them in the palm of his hands. They were his people. He was their father. He was their God. And so circumcision was the sign that these were God's people and they belonged to him. He belonged to them. But there was a problem for these Israelites that had crossed over the Jordan River, because ever since they'd come out of Egypt, they'd wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. None of those men who had got now across the Jordan River had been circumcised. And it wasn't that they weren't God's people as well, but they needed to go through this ritual of circumcision so that they could be seen as, or so they would make that commitment to be God's people. You see, this is God's dream that is unfolding for them. They needed to be circumcised to demonstrate their willingness to commit again to the covenant that God had made with them. Take a look at Genesis 17, verses 12 to 14. It says, "For the generations to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised, including those born in your household or bought with money from a foreigner. Whether born in your household or bought with your money, they must be circumcised. My covenant in your flesh is to be an everlasting covenant." And verse 14 says, "Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." If the people who had crossed over the Jordan River, who were being recipients of the dream unfolding, were not prepared to renew their covenant, the covenant with God through the act of circumcision, then they were to be cut off. They would not be participants in receiving the dream. So I want us to step back just a little bit and understand what's going on here, because remember, this is not Joshua's dream, this is God's dream. This was not the Israelites' dream, this is God's dream, this is God's plan. And God is laying out the conditions, the terms and conditions for receiving this dream in its fulfillment. And anyone who chose not to tick the little box at the bottom of the website that says, "I agree to the terms and conditions," we're never going to get any further through that website. Okay? I'm not sure they had websites then, but you understand what I'm saying, okay? And circumcision was that tick of the box that says, we agree, we will be your faithful people. You are our God, and we are your people. And we receive that act of circumcision as a sign and a seal of the covenant that we're making. So the covenant is sealed by that. The Israelites could not continue to receive the blessing of the dream if they chose not to renew the covenant with God. The second step that they were to prepare in was to reaffirm their confidence in the Lord. Verse 8 says this: "After the whole nation had been circumcised, they remained where they were in camp until they were healed." Think about that just for a moment. All the men of fighting age have now been circumcised, were instructed to remain in camp until they have healed. Now, I want to be a little bit careful here, but these men are in pain, okay? These men are in pain. They're in recovery. They are camped just a matter of 2 kilometers away from Jericho. And they are in recovery after surgery. And if the men of Canaan had decided to rise up against them, they would be very vulnerable to the attack from the people of Canaan. They were completely, in those days, in the hands of God. Completely at His mercy. There was an opportunity for them to place their confidence completely in the one who had brought them across the River Jordan. Their confidence now cannot be in their own ability, but in the one who has led them to that point. It will take great faith in the Lord to simply wait and to trust Him. In the past, by the way, their ancestors had done the opposite of that. Remember that? They sent the spies into to Canaan, went across the Jordan River, came back with glowing reports of the promised land. It is a land filled with milk and honey and the produce. And they brought grapes back that had to be carried on a pole between 2 people. Can you imagine a bunch of grapes like that? And then they looked at the people and they said, "They're too big. We can't do it." They didn't have confidence in God. God had brought them to that point. He had separated the Red Sea. They'd walked through the wilderness. They'd got across the Jordan. The spies have come there. And then all of a sudden they said, no, it's too hard. We can't do it. Their confidence was not in God. Their confidence was in their own ability. 40 years later, the next generation of Israelites are in the same position. Would they trust God completely now? Would they put their confidence in Him completely, or would they turn and run again? The instruction to remain in the camp until they were healed was a huge step of faith, but from the Israelites it was a reaffirmation of their confidence in God Himself. You are our God. We trust you. Our confidence is not in our abilities, our confidence is in you. And over throughout history, God's people have not been able to take care of themselves. Over and over, God's people have recognized that they needed God to demonstrate His ability and His determination to take hold of them. Think about Noah and his family. Think about the 3 Hebrews in the fiery furnace. Think about Daniel in the lion's den. Time after time after time, God has demonstrated His ability to take care of His people who are in difficult circumstances. And the list goes on. The Israelites camped at Gilgal, about 2 kilometers away from the city of Jericho, and had to reaffirm their confidence in the God who had brought them that far. The third step, preparation, is to remove their condemnation by the Lord. Look at verse 9. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." What's the reproach of Egypt? Well, one meaning of that word reproach is the word shame. He has rolled away the shame of Egypt. This means that even though they were God's people in a covenant relationship with Him, they were still in a position of slavery. Egypt represented slavery. Today, I've rolled away the shame of slavery. They were God's children, but He had a land and a promise for them, but they couldn't get there at that point in time. So for the nation, this place called Gilgal has become really important because that's where they had begun this journey into the promised land, and the shame of slavery was now gone. In fact, the word Gilgal means a rolling. And it's the idea that there's an oppression that's been rolled off. It's like God's rolled off something that's been weighing them down. This shame of being slaves. For 430 years they were in Egypt. 430 years. 40 years they were wandering through the desert where they were in a different kind of slavery. And now at Gilgal, the reproach of Egypt is rolled away. As they wandered through the desert, they continued to even act independently of God. There was an incident at Mount Sinai, if you remember, where they made a golden calf, decided that they would worship that rather than God. Still in slavery. Now in Gilgal, the promised land, God tells Joshua that the burden of condemnation has been lifted. You are no longer slaves. This is your land. You are to take possession of this. You're now my children. You are free from condemnation. And the lifting of the reproach from Egypt, this condemnation, must have been an incredibly freeing experience for the Israelites. They've walked in and it's now their land. God has given it to them. They carried the burden of condemnation for 470 years, and now that was removed, they were ready to move on. Step 4. Remember the commitment of the Lord. When the Israelites were freed from Egypt, it happened because God sent, if you recall, the angel of death that visited every home. And the Israelites were told to place some blood on the doorpost of their homes. And when the angel of death saw the blood on the doorpost of the home of the Israelites, the angel of death passed over that house. And so the Israelites were told to celebrate the Passover on a regular basis. That night began this ceremony of the Passover meal. It was a celebration of the salvation of the Lord. Verse 10 tells us this: on the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. Here now, in the promised land, and before they proceed any further, they celebrate the Passover. They celebrate the salvation of God. And through the wilderness, there was only ever one other observance of the Passover in that 40 years. It happened at Mount Sinai. It's recorded in Numbers chapter 9 if you want to read it. But Passover for the Jews was meant to be celebrated for all time, not just a one-off kind of celebration. And in the whole 40-year period, it had only happened once. Now God says, let's remember what I've done. Remember what God has done. And Passover was celebrated also by eating of the produce of that was in the promised land. Verse 11, the day after the Passover, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, the unleavened bread and roasted grain. And verse 12 says the manna stopped that day. After they ate the fruit from the land, there was no longer any manna for the Israelites, but that year they ate the produce of Canaan. For 40 years they've been eating manna, picking it up every morning, and quail. 40 years. Now they're eating of the produce of the land, and guess what? The manna stops, the quail stops. Now the Israelites have renewed their commitment to God. God gives them a taste of the fulfillment of the dream. There was a sign, a confirmation that God had faithfully fulfilled his promise. He told them he would provide. He's now provided for them. He told them he would do it. He's now done it. He told them he would give them the land that is flowing with milk and honey. He's now been faithful to do what he said he would do. They celebrated and remembered the commitment of the Lord. And then the fifth and final step is to recognize the control of the Lord. Joshua is scoping out the territory towards Jericho. He encounters a man standing before him. It's found in verses 13 through to 15. It says, Joshua was near Jericho. He looked up, saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" And look at verse 14. He says, "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord I've now come." And Joshua fell face down in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for your servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Here's Joshua, who is taking a look at the city of Jericho. He's scoping it out like a leader on the night before. It's only about 2 kilometers away, and he can see the fortified walls of the city of Jericho, and he can see that they're not that far away. It's a normal thing for him as a leader to be doing. And Jericho is the first foe, the first enemy that's going to stand in their way of taking possession of the whole of that land. And then he comes face to face with this man that stands with a drawn sword. Now, if it's a drawn sword, he's ready for what? Battle. He's ready for war. If it's in the sheath, he's not ready yet. Okay? He's got the drawn sword. And Joshua did the most natural thing for a leader at that time to find out who does he belong to. Right? He's got his sword drawn. And he says, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" And his response, of course, is, "Neither. I'm not for you or for them." But here's what he said: "As commander of the Lord's army, I've come." Now, there's some speculation as to who this man is. Is he an angel? Is he something different? But given that this being did not condemn Joshua for bowing down to him, it seems to me that he's a manifestation of Christ himself. Do I understand that? No. But angels often refused the worship of man. This commander did not. And God has a new revelation for Joshua. He's saying this: if you're going to go into this battle, if you're going to inherit the promises that God has for you, then a new leadership has to take place. It wasn't God now helping Joshua with his plans. It was now Joshua receiving instructions from the commander of the Lord's army. See the difference? No longer was God just helping Joshua to do the leadership. It was now God, or recognizing that Joshua had to submit to God's commands. God was the one who was in control. God was the one who was going to give directions. God was the one who said, I'm not on your side or theirs. I've actually come to take over. In other words, I have preeminence. It's not me helping you. It's going to be my directions. It's going to be my will, my plans, not yours. And that's clearly an issue of authority. Who's calling the shots? And Joshua recognized that. He bowed down and he says, what message does my Lord have for me? And then if you read the next chapter, we didn't get into that today, we'll do that in 2 weeks' time, but you read the next chapter, he gives you the instructions of what he's to do. Before the Israelites went any further, they needed to be very clear about who was in control. Well, that's well and good. But what does it mean for our dream? What does it mean for the dream for our life, the plan that God has for our life, or the plan that God has for us as a church? Here we are standing at our own Gilgal, waiting to take on our Jericho. So what do we need to do in order to prepare for the adventure that's ahead of us? Well, here's some very practical steps for you. First of all, if you want to take hold of God's dream for your life or God's dream for the church, we need to first of all renew our covenant with the Lord. What is it that identifies us as God's people? What identifies me as a Christian? What is it that shows that I belong to God? Is there a place for us before we move on for examining our life and separating ourselves out from all that is ungodly? I believe there is. And I think before we proceed even to our Faith Sunday in a couple of weeks' time, before we proceed in seeing God's plan for our life unfold, we need to actually renew our commitment to the Lord. And some of you, for the very first time, need to say, do you know what? I need to surrender myself to Christ. I need to get this commitment right in my life. You see, the unfolding of God's plan for your life or for the church is for those who are part of His community or for those who belong to Him. God has a plan for your life. I'm absolutely convinced of that. He has a plan for our church. I'm absolutely convinced of that. But it's for His people. And the way we become a part of His people is by surrendering ourselves to His lordship in our life and by acknowledging His death on the cross, by saying no to living our way and saying yes to living Christ's way. It's a renewal of the commitment. What we need today is a circumcision of the heart that actually receives the redemptive work of Christ in our life. Secondly, if we're to prepare for the dream that God has in store for us, we need to reaffirm our confidence in the Lord. Our confidence. And just as the Israelites had to spend some days doing this, let me urge you this morning, in the midst of your pain, in the midst of your struggle, in the midst of your heartache, place your confidence in God. Place your confidence in God. Some of you are doing it tough this morning. Some of you are really struggling to actually put one foot in front of the other. Some of you are not sure what the future holds. You're not sure what's going to happen. Some of you are dealing with the loss of loved ones. Some of you are dealing with separation from families. Some of you are dealing with all kinds of issues. Our confidence is not in those circumstances of our life. Our confidence is in God. We need to renew our confidence in God. He is the one who will strengthen us. He is the one who is able to bring you through. He is the one who is able. And then thirdly, as we move forward, it's important to remember that we are no longer under condemnation. Some of you are battling with the condemnation of past habits or past sins or past circumstances, past failures. Some of you feel like you're bound up in habits so much that they trip you up day after day after day. Christ has removed the condemnation from us. Romans 8 verse 1 says, now there is now no condemnation for those that are in Christ Jesus. For the law of Spirit of life has freed you from the law of sin and death. There is no condemnation. If you're battling this morning because you're stuck in this rut of past failures and Satan keeps reminding you of the things that you've done wrong in your past, Christ wants to actually remove the reproach of Egypt from you. You're no longer under condemnation. Satan will create all kinds of doubts in your mind about God's love for you. He'll tell you that you'll never make it. He'll tell you that you're just a failure. He'll tell you that you've done it wrong all the time and you're going to continue to do it wrong. You'll never be able to get on top of those things. You'll never have victory in your life. And Christ says, I've already removed condemnation. You can have victory in your life. God, through Jesus, has rolled back the reproach of Egypt. Fourthly, take a look around at what God has given you and what He's done for you. His commitment for you and His plan for you is faultless. He is 100% behind you. He has provided all that you need. So give thanks to the Lord. Taste and see that He is good. Walk by faith in the fulfillment of the dream. God has been faithful in the past. He'll be faithful in the future. You may not be able to see it clearly, but He urges you to receive it by faith. I want to see the things that can't be seen. I want to dream the dreams that can't be dreamed. Walking by faith. And then, of course, finally acknowledge and submit to the control and authority of the Lord. God's plan for your life, God's plan for our church, God's dream for your life or our church, it's His dream. It's not yours. Sometimes our plans for our life don't match up with what God's dream is. Sometimes our plans for the church don't match up with what God's plan is. It's God's dream. He's the leader. This battle is His battle. He's the commander-in-chief. He calls the shots. He directs the paths. And you can never experience the fullness of God's plan for your life until you acknowledge Him as the Lord of your life. We sang a little chorus before, He is Lord. In fact, we're going to do that again at the end if we can. Is that okay, Matthias? He is Lord. It's an affirmation that God is the boss. He's the master. We are the slaves. Or the servants and the slaves. He is the master over us. He is Lord. And you can never experience the fullness of His plan for your life or His dream for your life until you acknowledge His lordship over your life. It's not just a matter of accepting Christ as your Savior. It's now actually submitting to His rule in your life. He is Lord. It's His dream. It's His plan. It's His unfolding purpose for your life. How do we view our battles? How do we view our problems that we're facing? Sometimes we say to God, well, God, will you help me in my plans? Will you help me to move on? And God's saying, well, actually, I've got a better plan for your life. How about you align your will with my will, not the other way around? Henry Blackaby, I've shared this with you before, says this. He says, when you wake up in the morning and you ask God to go with you in your day, don't do that. Incredibly arrogant. God's been working all night. He's unfolding his plan. When you wake up in the morning, say, okay, God, show me where you're working. I want to join you today. Don't ask God to bless your plans. Ask your will. Ask God to show you how your will can align with what he's already doing. He's the Lord. He's the Lord. And then walk by faith. Even if you don't understand it, even if you don't hear something clearly, walk by faith, trusting God, saying, God, today I just want to submit myself to you. I want to walk by faith. Because the true response of Christians is to give Christ the preeminence, first place in your life. In fact, some of you have heard me say this before. When Leanne and I got married, Leanne didn't just become number one in my list of girlfriends. Okay? She became my list. Now you're going, When you surrender to God, he doesn't just become number one in your list of gods that you're going to surrender yourself to. He becomes your list. There are no others. He is Lord. He is the master. He deserves to be preeminent. He deserves to be in number one spot, the list. There is no other God. The dream cannot be fulfilled until God is Lord of our life. The dream for our church can never be fulfilled unless God is the Lord of the church. He's the master. He calls the shots. So over the next couple of weeks, as you examine what it means to actually be a part of the dream for this church, start with this point. God, this is your church. I am your servant. You're the Lord of the church. You're the Lord of my life. When Joshua was confronted with this statement, he knew how to humble himself before the Lord. And his question to this man that he confronted was very simple. He says, what message do you have for me? What a great question to ask. God, what is it that you want me to do? What is it that you want me to say? Today, when I leave from this place, God, how do you want me to respond to the conversations I'm going to have, to the circumstances I find myself in? Are you willing to show that you're willing to obey him, to submit to him, to take yourself right out of the picture and say, God, you're in control? You know, often people talk about an illustration where, when you're driving a car, instead of you being in control of the car, put God in the driver's seat. I don't like that at all. Okay? It's not that I don't like God being in the driver's seat. It's just that I don't think it's a good illustration. I think a better illustration is actually that I'm sitting in the driver's seat and I'm listening to the instructions of Siri. God's directing. He doesn't take away my free will to choose which way I go. I'm listening to the instructions of this voice that tells me where to go. And I'm following him step by step. You never get rid of your free will to choose to go a different direction. And the little voice keeps saying, do a U-turn, turn around, turn around, turn around, then you turn it off. Some of you have done that in your life with God. You said, God, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to be obedient to you. I'm going to give myself to you. And God says, well, you need to stop doing that. You need to turn your life around. And you keep going, and he says, you need to turn your life around. You need to stop doing that. You need to change that behavior. You need to stop that habit in your life. And God says, we say to God, I'm going to turn the volume down a little bit. I'm going to turn off that GPS. Don't do it. Don't do it. God is far more trustworthy than Siri, by the way. Okay? He knows the route that your life needs to take. He knows the direction our church needs to go in. And so we ought to listen to him. He's the Lord. He's the Lord. And it doesn't matter what you're facing, whether it's a health issue, whether it's a relationship issue, whether it's a financial issue, whatever it might be, God knows the best way through. Not necessarily around it, by the way. The best way through. And he can be trusted. I'm going to get our worship